Good morning, hello everyone. I would like to start by welcoming you all to today's research seminar, which I believe again is a very timely endeavor, given the fact that we have the Iraqi elections 2 weeks ago. My name is Sadr. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the research project Striking for the Margins, and our guest speaker today is Dr. Akeel Abbas from Iraq. Dr. Abbas is a Middle East specialist currently teaching at the American University of Iraq in Sulaimani. Before teaching at the American University of Iraq, he taught in several other American universities in the States, including Old Dominion University, University of Houston, and Purdue University, where he obtained his PhD degree in culture studies. And Dr. Abbas also worked for several years as a journalist covering Iraqi and Middle Eastern politics. Specializing mainly in cultural studies, his current research and academic interests revolve around modernity, democratization, and the politics of identity in the Middle East. And today's seminar falls within the scope of identity politics, actually. Iraq traditionally is one of the important and interesting cases in terms of identity politics. It's the history of exclusions, alienations, exiles, so on and so forth, based on identities. As the Saddam administration ended, a very politically and administratively fragmented structure surfaced in Iraq in 2003, and no one was really prepared for newly emerging political dynamics, actually. And in the case of weakened state authorities and insecure conditions, identity politics has become one of the main canons of the Iraqi politics, and the importance of sectarian, religious, regional, and tribal affiliations in Iraqi political life is an ongoing reality that must be dealt in detail. And recently, groups of different religious and ethnic identities of increasing influence have become actors of the power struggle in Iraq that cannot be taken lightly. And we have been witnessing this power struggle not only between different groups with different identities, but also within the same identity blocks. Considering that various Iraqi ethnic and sectarian groups do not constitute a monolithic structure, the differences between their methods and approaches to state, to politics, to religion, or to sovereignty, for instance, should be realized. And we shouldn't fail to notice that all these struggles, interactions, and political realities on the ground have a transformative effect on each and every single different group. Over the last 15 years, whereas some groups have become much more moderate and pragmatist, even leaving some of their ideological principles behind, some others have become much more radical. So there are different and many various groups, traditional groups, political Islamist groups, Septentrian groups, mainstream groups, and it's a very dynamic structure in Iraqi politics right now. And today, with this seminar, we will be hearing some insights about the transformation of Shiism in Iraq since 2003. And here is the question, I think: what has changed and to what extent, and how in terms of Shiism in Iraq since 2003? Without elucidating the historical trajectory, how we come to this point, it will be really difficult to grasp the current state of affairs in Iraq. So Dr. Abbas will be enlightening us in that regard, and I would like to thank him for being with us today, and looking forward to hearing, and the floor is all yours, and you have 45-50 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction. Thank you for making this opportunity available for me, and thank you for being here. I'm sure people can do better things this morning. But anyhow, so hopefully I'll make this useful and interesting. In order to understand the current moment in Iraq, particularly the Shia moment, I think it's useful to use some conceptual tools. There's the wrong tendency just to engage politics directly, as if politics is a matter of experience and only personal insights. It doesn't operate within conceptual tools that would help us understand how we arrived at this moment and where we are going. And I'd like to begin from the founding moment of Shiism as a doctrine, as a set of ideas, not only a set of feelings, loose feelings and political positions. That's probably the 4th, 5th Hijri century Baghdad, the Buwaid Baghdad under the Buwaid dynasty control, pro-Shia dynasty. And in that historical moment, 3-4 centuries after the emergence of Islam, there was a constellation of Shia scholars that brought together the edifice, the doctrinal edifice of Shiism, set of ideas that are closely related, coherent, that function more or less consistently. German idealism in the 19th century contributed to our understanding the concept of a worldview. Very, very useful concept. And a worldview is really the set of ideas that would allow an entire culture to access the world in a specific way. It's a comprehensive approach to the world that would include, views about politics, about justice, about the meaning of life, about sexuality, about economics, so on and so forth. And a worldview is developed by a culture, an entire culture. It's a generational, if not multi-generational endeavor. But there is the moment of constellation, the moment of codification, where this worldview, the set of ideas that make up that worldview, becomes codified, made clear. We could access it directly as a set of ideas intellectually written, documented, and that what happened in Baghdad, the 4th century, and what I call that worldview is a purist worldview. What does a purist worldview mean? A purist worldview is a view that actually focuses on the notion or the assumption really deep into Shiism that the realm of human experience is divided into a conflict between the impure and the pure and the impure, not the sacred and the profane. That's a different concept that could relate to it. It's really different. The tainted and the pure assumes that there is a reliable, pure, authentic, definitive, hence divine access to knowledge that is available to the selected few. And there's the other larger realm, the realm of the majority, where knowledge and henceforth the experience of life is tainted. Why? Because its access to knowledge is human. It depends on the human experience to develop knowledge. And Shiism, in its purest understanding, does mistrust any form of human knowledge that does not have some kind of defined authentication. Henceforth, the idea of infallibility. Infallibility is the freedom the freedom from error. Error is not a form of learning. Error is a form of taintment. It disqualifies you from knowing and from judging and from assuming positions of responsibility. And if one reads the Shia history in dealing with more or less the Sunni world, you see like this dynamic. Sunni errors are moments of denunciation, of moral denunciation, not moments of error from the Shia perspective. It is something that disqualifies Sunniism, from being legitimate. And that also includes other faiths, but Sunniism is defining for Shiism because Shiism historically emerged as a protest movement, a protest response to Sunniism, to how Sunniism understood the world, the Sunni worldview. Different topic. Now, the sense of purism basically established, and it's a very pre-modern idea. It existed in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Islam it existed among the different groups. Now we're talking about really the Shia version of that pre-modern idea. The idea of the chosen people, the selected people, the people who are selected by God, the Christian equivalent of a city on a hill, so on and so forth. One group that is privileged through divine access to have the truth and to live out the truth. And the job of others, the moral obligation of others, is to follow that truth. And within this, there's the establishment of a certain hierarchy. You are to follow, not to contribute. Your only legitimate contribution is to discover that truth and to follow it. Now, as a pre-modern idea, this was widely accepted. Each group has its own truth and wanted to impose it on others, preach it to others, so on and so forth. But the emergence of modernity, messed up all of this, because what modernity does is that basically it refuses the hierarchy and it acknowledges a human experience as a form of knowledge. You build your own experience of life through your own engagement with life. And the error becomes a legitimate source of knowledge, a legitimate source of growing up. Now, in the construction of the purist Shia worldview, one significant element, what Lacan or Slavoj Žižek would say, the nodal point. The nodal point is what we call the anchoring moment, the anchoring point, a significant idea in that worldview that makes the whole worldview coherent, doesn't allow it to slide. Okay, and in that sense, in that nodal moment or nodal point is what is called the notion of oppression, marginalization. Because we possess the truth, because we're the carrier of a divine message, others, because of their anti-divinity, their fear of this divine message, will oppress us and would engage in a systematic behavior that would basically exclude us. And then we internalize this exclusion. It becomes part of our own identity. Being oppressed is equivalent to being right. Now, this is a discursive arrangement. In other words, if you engage the history of Shiism in general, okay, at least Iraqi Shiism in the past 300-400 years, and I would make the argument, the entire history of Shiism, you would not find that systematic, okay, act of marginalization. And lots of Western scholars have bought the idea, they repeat it, journalists repeat it. It's taken as an article of faith. I think any serious historical investigation would show that this is really very difficult to defend. But regardless, it is part of the Shia conception of self. And it has translated or transmitted itself in a variety of ways where others have believed it. And I think one great success, if one would pride oneself on that kind of success, is that political Shia Islamist movements have basically made it common that marginalization occurred. They helped, okay, regular Shias to act as marginalized human beings. That sense of marginalization existed in Shia theology before that. But that kind of theology was hardly accessed by regular people. Now, with the politicizing moment of Shia Islamist movement, this becomes a political understanding of the self. Okay? So Shias see themselves generally as marginalized. Now, my argument is that the purist worldview, the way it functions, led to alienation rather than marginalization. Meaning, my ideas about the world, these very ideas exclude me from engaging in the world. And of course, others are not altruistic. They would come and say, oh, no, come in. No, I want you to experience the world. Non-Shias are not interested. I mean, nobody is interested in saving you from your own act of self-exclusion. So, alienation functions, there's Hegelian understanding of it, a Marxist understanding of it, but essentially what alienation is a structural imbalance. Structural imbalance in feelings and in reality, where you feel you're excluded from mainstream reality. Generally speaking, alienation would emerge from an act of marginalization. Okay? In the Shia context, that act of marginalization is really not an external force. It is the Shia conception of self. The idea that we're chosen. And because we're chosen, because we're truthful, we're targeted, and so on and so forth. Now, how does this play out in politics? I think I'm on schedule here. When the Iraqi state was established in the 1920s, it was the first moment that this concept of purism was faced. But the way it was faced is actually there's this moment of separation. The formal structure of purism remained intact until today. The ideas, the theological ideas, the political conceptions, okay, remained intact. Purists targeted, marginalized. However, what the Iraqi state did, starting in the 1920s, part of its project to create a sense of people, a sense of nationhood, so on and so forth. There was this gradual, slow, but eventually a large-scale integration process, where you move from being a villager or a Shia or these secondary, what became later secondary identities, they were at the time primary identities, you move into the whole notion of citizenship. And part of moving into citizenship is really an intellectual and discursive transformation. Now, your source of knowledge, Shias didn't go to school. State schools were banned based on a Shia conception. Working for the state, that's part of the purist worldview. You don't work for the state because the state is tainting. You don't get your knowledge through a formal education, state formal education, because that gives you the wrong kind of knowledge. It would taint your purity. Okay, starting in the 20s, the state building the schools and basically trying to attract the population, the set of services and inducements and the realities that the modern state brought to Iraq actually caused lots of Shias to enter in the project. Okay, not because of an intellectual decision, but rather because of experiential reality. We're part of reality. And so lots of Shias went through schools, lots of Shias used the services that the state made available, the court system, the media, the health system, so on and so forth. So there's this gradual movement of being impure. Now, part of citizenship is the idea of equality. The idea that your religion, more or less, is a private business. And you're an Iraqi, just like a Sunni is an Iraqi, a Yazidi is an Iraqi, and a Christian is an Iraqi. Now, whether the system was actually fully equal, that's a different point. It was not. But the way the state at least conducted itself by promoting the idea of equality and trying to work on it to a certain extent, creating zones of equality in certain spheres in life of Iraq. In education, you can access the educational system, whether you're Yazidi, Christian, Sunni, Shia, you can access the court system, you can access the health system. These were not discriminatory spheres. These were spheres that were available to others. Now, was the identity of the state, was it egalitarian? Was it equal? No. It favored, a Muslim identity. It favored an Arab identity. So there were defining moments that were discriminatory. But this still was enough to make purism indefensible. As a practice, it wasn't possible to continue the purist worldview. This process probably continued for 50, 60 years. Now, lots of Shias actually experienced an impure lifestyle, internalized it, developed a sense of identity, primary identity, being an Iraqi. And I would say this was the experience of the majority of Iraqi Shias, particularly because of their migration from the rural areas into the urban centers, because citizenship and modernity really functioned well in urban centers. I mean, this is historical even in Europe. Modernity was very strong in the urban centers. The rural areas were more or less on the margins. Now, what the dichotomy here that we see played out in 2003 and after is that although she has experienced citizenship, experienced impurity, so to speak, the formal structure, the ideas that fed into purism, that dealt with Shias as marginalized, as selected, chosen, targeted because of who they are, that structure, and this is the doctrinal structure of Shiism, and that's the theological aspect of Shiism, that structure remained intact, didn't change, didn't transform. So practice did not turn into theory. It was more or less separated or ignored. If you look at Islamist parties, if you look at the formal Shia institution, the Marja'iyya, if you look at their writings, that aspect of the experience does not exist. There is no discussion of it. The discussion is about events that happened 1400 years ago. Yeah, basically hark back to the moment of purism. And that very significant, important experience after the 1920s basically disappears. And it's left for people's memories to make a sense of it. And with the absence of conceptual tools for ordinary people, the experience is almost lost. Now, let's come to 2003. We have 2003, the overthrowing of the Saddam regime, political movements basically thrust in the forefront of power because of the American invasion, and there's this dominance of the world, the dominance of this religious worldview that was resurrected more or less in the 1990s as a consequence of the sanctions. The Iraqi state project of modernity stopped, practically stopped. The state couldn't fund the project anymore. So we have really modernization in Iraq that was incomplete, couldn't pursue, its goals to the end. When the state failed, was incapable because of the sanctions in the 1990s, it opened the door to the population basically to regress to their own pre-modern identities as a form of protection, patronage, the clan, the sect, a sense of spiritual assurance, a sense of a material assurance, because the state is no longer capable of providing these assurances. Now you're left to your own. So what we see here is the re-emergence of this purist worldview again. Saddam is overthrown, and of course, American policymakers didn't pay attention to these things, and neither did they listen to the people who knew. There was an overwhelming majority of Iraqi Shia political movements that basically promoted identity politics. And when I say identity politics, I'm basically saying a purist worldview, a harking back to original Shiism, its own conception of itself, marginalization, the right to get some kind of justice, some kind of redressing the balance. Our oppressors are more or less the Sunnis, and now 2003 is a moment of reckoning, is a moment of justice. And justice in this context means more or less punishing the oppressors. And the oppressors here are a group rather than individuals. And henceforth there was the equivalence, equating Sunnis more or less with Baathism, a privileged class that ruled Iraq at the expense of Shias. Now, sounds appealing, seductive, ultimately wrong. The facts on the ground actually do not allow this neat separation. But at that time, the overwhelming majority of the population, the Shia population, bought into this as a consequence of the 90s and really the lack of a thorough, serious educational system, absence of intellectual tools, and really a thinking class in Iraq. Most of the exiles who returned came back equipped with that purist worldview. So 2003, you have this group of people, this group of political movements, Shia political movements, who have an automatic majority, winning elections, not because of what they have done or what they were going to do, but because of who they are, what they represent. These automatic majorities, because of this ethno-sectarian sharing system, power sharing system, that sanctioned identity politics in Iraq. So what we see here is that the Shia purist worldview is put to the test. against really the desires of the Shia political class. They thought they could ride this for so long. It is easy to invoke historical grievances. It is easy to invoke this purest moment of who we are versus who they are. But reality is a lot more complicated than this. You have to provide electricity, you have to provide security, you have to have a good health system, a good educational system. You have a world that is open. You have the problem that's called the internet, where people can see other experiences and could compare. And the consequence of these comparisons are really negative for you, because others managed to do something to basically create a system that's decent, that provides services for people, whereas you failed. So these comparisons actually didn't work well for the Shia political class. And it was the moment that marginalization, and I would say the first 5-10 years, of course dates here are not definitive. These social political transformations are not easy to pinpoint historically. It was that moment that this happened. But overall, the theme of marginalization, the beloved theme of purist Shia movements, played out well, and it actually accused that political class for a few years of any responsibility. And by 2012, we noticed a shift where marginalization no longer effective, where you are dealt with as a full political movement responsible for the future, for the present, okay, not for the past. And to highlight or to explain this more clearly, more in political manifestations, I would stop at two moments, what I consider two important moments in understanding this. Two political events or political pronouncements, let's say, and that would really show how this transformation occurred. In 2006, it was at the end of 2006, Saddam was executed. And the scene of execution was very problematic. It was done in Baghdad, really handled so poorly. Saddam emerged as the victim, as the hero. State functionaries acted in a sectarian way. It was an act of sectarian revenge rather than a state executing justice. And there was an outcry, among lots of Iraqis, including Shias. Why did you basically bungle this moment? Why did you run this moment so horribly? Why couldn't you function as a state? Rather, you functioned as an injured sect, exacting a sectarian form of revenge. Maliki, and that's the moment as I said, it's the moment of codification. All of these ideas, there's a moment where they're pronounced. And Maliki, in a meeting, this is widely reported, and I think it was truthful. Even the government, even Maliki, even the Iraqi officials, most of them were Shias who were involved in the execution, couldn't pride themselves on that moment. But the justification they offered is very telling. What Maliki said in a meeting when this bungled execution of Saddam was carried out to an international and regional as well as local outcry, his answer was the following, very telling. We know how to be executed. We don't know how to execute. Very important, and you have to see, he really sums up, regardless what we think of the man, he is an expression, he's an authentic expression of the Shia worldview. We know how to be executed. We know how to be marginalized, okay? We know how to be dealt with as inferior. as wanted, as the minority, that should be punished. We have experience in being oppressed. Okay, we don't know how to execute. The whole idea of executing actually invokes a state. It assumes a state that functions, a state that has institutions, a state that can act fairly, impartially. He was basically saying, excuse us from being a state. We're still not there. Because we are traumatized, marginalized, okay, we cannot have the fair institutions that you like, that you dream of. These might happen, but not now. We're still traumatized. Basically, he was giving up on his responsibility as a prime minister. A prime minister basically acting as an angered, marginalized Shia. And he was the most powerful person in Iraq. The person who has, the state apparatus under his disposal, more or less. So this is one moment. The other part that is useful, usefully painful too, in this regard, is that the overwhelming majority of the Shias actually accepted that. It did go, that moment went. It was, temporary anger by the Shia elite. Most ordinary Shias were elated at the execution of Saddam. They went out in the street showing their joy. The form of the execution, how it occurred, the absence of the state in it, the absence of institutions, went unnoticed. And when the issue was pressed, it's like, you're being too intellectual, too philosophical. Yeah. That moment is still the notion of the marginalized Shia that we're traumatized and henceforth you should not hold us accountable to the international standards of statehood. And until that moment, this was accepted, and it still gave the Shia ruling elite lots of license. Even after that, they got elected again. Now, the second moment that would actually, to me, show the transformation or the movement from a sense of marginalization, from a sense of irresponsibility, institutional irresponsibility, to one of responsibility, I would say, is a Sadr moment. The Sadrs began this, and they were, in 2006, the strongest supporters of Maliki, and they made the argument that he made, even about the execution. It's something you should let go. The important thing is that we executed him. How we executed him is irrelevant. It is the fact of execution rather than the modality of the execution. And that's really the difference between the state and the non-state. It's the modality that was basically sacrificed. Sadr 2012 makes a very daring, I would say, most Shias were upset with him. When Maliki went the fast path of being dictatorial, really ignoring the separation between the three powers, using the military for his own political gains, targeting Sunnis, so on and so forth, basically turning into an unjust ruler. Sadr worked with Allawi and what's his name, Barzani, in order to come up with a parliamentarian majority to overthrow Maliki, and he was very, very close to succeeding, probably 4 or 5 hours between him and success. Then there an intervention occurred, and that stopped. But that's the context, the moment that was very important, and Sadr actually discusses this moment. He was in Iran, in Tehran, and he was getting into his plane. He was flying from Tehran to Erbil, where Barzani was waiting for him. And Sulaimani was there with him, holding his hand, trying to convince him not to get in the plane. And he basically said to Sadr, do not go. You are hurting Shias. This is not good for the sect. And Sadr's response, this is good for the sect. This is good for Iraq. And he later, actually, he later expands on this, on the media, he said it. It hurts us as Shias to act unjustly. It hurts us that we don't act as a state. Okay, oppressing the Sunnis hurts Shiism itself. Okay. So we're dealing with somebody who comes from a very traditional religious way of thinking, from this worldview of purism, turning it on its head because of the realities. You know, this was preceded by his sympathy with the Sunni protest movement. What he could see is grievances. What he could see was injustices, regardless whether, you know, the victims of these injustices were Shias or Sunnis or Kurds. It's the fact of the injustice itself. And we have to respond to this injustice. And we have to respond to this injustice not only as a sect, but as a state. So he's basically owning up, acknowledging responsibility. You know, this is the sect's responsibility. The sect has to act responsibly, and it has failed too. And I am standing against this, and I'm using its institutional tools to rectify this. At that time, I would say, I mean, I don't have factual evidence. This is anecdotal evidence. The overwhelming majority of Shias did not like what they heard. They didn't like that Sadr went the other side. He continued, actually. And I think the results of the elections bear out his view that we should function as a state, we should function fairly, we should function institutionally. Iraqism is the overarching identity, not Shiism, not Sunniism. That was really his argument all the way from 2012, where he was in the minority. Even some of his audience left him, and he acknowledged this. He said, I'm taking positions that my constituency doesn't like, but it is important that I do this. What Sadr is doing, he basically moved from marginalization, because I think he believes in the marginalization narrative. He moved from marginalization to identification. What is identification? We identify with the state. We are the state. We're not inferior, we're not traumatized. You know, we identify with the people, okay? And there's this larger identity that we all are part of, and that identity is protected, is maintained through the state, a very modernist position. Now, this is not a clash of personalities. This is not about Maliki as a person or Sadr as a person, but rather this is about two trends in Shiism, in modern Shiism. Maliki has a constituency. There's probably a large number of Shias who do not necessarily now follow him, but they follow the trend in Shiism that is based on the notion of marginalization. You can think of the Fatah alliance, electoral alliance, conquering, okay, the electoral list, okay, who basically accept Maliki's position. They didn't learn it from Maliki, they learned it from Shiism. Now they are presented. The whole idea of the popular mobilization units is that the sect defends the state. And why are we defending the state? Because there are those who are anti-Shias attacking the state. It's a religious fatwa that led to this whole mobilization, not the state. Now, that's a different dynamic. But what I'm trying to say is that in the large, rich, and diverse spectrum of Shiism, there is a significant force in Iraqi Shia society that functions, perceives itself in terms of marginalization. On the other hand, there is, if we take election results as an indicator, and that would be not an easy indicator, because people do not necessarily vote based on philosophical reasons, okay, or intellectual reasons. There is also, I'm making the argument, there is also a significant force within Shiism that doesn't act or accept the notion of marginalization, but insist on identification. Basically, you identify with the modern institution of the state. You understand the current conflicts as manifestations of recent causes, not historical causes. And saying recent causes, we're talking about the last 20, 30 years, okay? Talk about services, talk about security, the failure of security. No, deal with the technical reasons. Don't tell me there are these arch enemies of Shiism who, no matter what you do, they will always target you. This primordial kind of animosity that no modern intervention would change it. Because that's really the purest worldview. It's the idea of Satan and God. They will be after you regardless because of who you are. And this is significant among Iraqi Shias. I think it's on the decline. The other side says, no, this is not about this primordial position. Of course, they don't say it that way, but the essence of their position is that invest in the current realities, treat Sunnis fairly, remove the causes of grievances, do not turn their cities into military barracks, okay? Get rid of de-Baathification, integrate them in the political process. So basically dealing with Sunnis and others as human beings who respond to positive measures. They're not really defined by what happened 1400 years ago. They're defined by their own current realities. And I think this last election, in many ways, was a vote, was a dispute, was a judgment within Shiism about which one represents the future. I think most Iraqi Shias went with the second one, regardless of what they actually intellectually or philosophically think. The way intellectual ideas function is very different from how politics functions. You side with a political position without really fully understanding its philosophical or intellectual implications. That is the immediacy of the position that matters to you. And the immediacy of the position is that I want services, I want security, I want reconciliation with the Sunnis, and these things are doable through certain acts and measures that the state has to institute. Now, do all of these people who believe in this necessarily believe or understand there is a purist Shia worldview that basically says Shias are all marginalized, and rightly so? No. But that's, that is the experience of life. You get implicated in positions, and it is only later these positions are crystallized, becoming intellectual positions. You see them with philosophical and intellectual clarity that was not available to you when you were directly implicated with them. That's basically the dynamic that I see going through this, more or less, is that the most significant development in Iraq, for me, is the serious beginning for Iraqi Shias, and to a certain extent, the Shia political movements, graduating painfully, slowly, from the thralls of marginalization, graduating from this worldview that has been functioning, that has given them a sense of agency, subjectivity for the last 1400 years. It is through the experience of politics, being in the political forefront, having to make decisions, having to face others, that you come actually This new sense of pragmatism revises your intellectual philosophical worldview without you even realizing that what you are doing will have significant consequences for how you view yourself. But at the moment, that awareness is not there. It's really how pragmatism revises ideology. How we see that our ideological self-conception is changing. But as it changes, we're not aware of the change because we are caught in the immediacy of political action. And with this, I conclude my talk. If you have any question, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abbas. It was really a stimulating presentation. I'm going to make a couple of points and observations and try to sum up the presentation before proceeding to the Q&A session and discussion. It seems to me that the dynamics of interaction between different Shia groups and their approaches to ideology, state, and politics are very complex and diverse since the American occupation. And the first initial failure that you mentioned of the Shia rule mainly referred to Maliki. And secondly, Arab uprisings and changing dynamics. And of course, finally, the emergence of ISIS made it much more complex and complicated. And the politicization of religious identities has shifted the representation of these identities from the realm of politics, religion, to politics. And it's possible to say that the ongoing tension between different religious groups, let's say the sectarian tensions, reached its peak with the Arab uprisings. And currently, the Middle East region is in an extraordinarily fragile condition with an unprecedented high, not only in Iraq but also in the other countries. But if we consider the last 15 years as a political learning process, then we may claim that there are some positive developments in terms of redefinition and reassessments of the respective ideological and political stances when we talk about the Shia political Islamist groups. By the way, this redefinition or reassessment of the political stance and the erosion of ideological firmness reminds me of the recent transformation in the other Islamist groups across the Middle East. For instance, in Tunisia, Ghannouchi has declared that they left the political Islam behind and they became like Muslim Democrats. So of course there's no one-to-one analogy, but there's a huge similarities as well. So they are getting more reformist and changing their approaches to state and sovereignty, for instance. And I understand that it's not just peculiar to Shiism or Sunni Islam, rather it's much more about changing interaction between religion and politics in a much more broader sense in the Middle East. And 2003 American occupation and the Arab uprisings were the two turning points in terms of political learning and testing process, as you mentioned, for the religious-oriented groups all around the region. You talked about the failure of Shia rule, the initial failure of the Shia rule, and you were mainly referring to Maliki administration. The de-Ba'athification process turned into a political tool for Maliki to marginalize and suppress his rivals as a punishment. And the exclusionist policies forced oppressed groups to go underground, to organize underground, and paved the way for the emergence of ISIS, or help it. And his alliances with radical splinter groups within Shia community, as opposed to collaboration with mainstream, moderate and centrist groups like the Sistani or some other Najaf ulama, impelled the central government to more uncompromising attitudes. So this was a reflection of the fact that they were not prepared to the post-2003 period, and it was harming to the social cohesion in Iraq. In that regard, I would like to mainly focus on the Sistani's role, and I'm going to ask about some questions about Sistani's role as well in this general picture in terms of pragmatism, ideology, purist network, etc. Knowing as a balancing factor in Iraq, Sistani, unlike the other political Islamist leaders, has been taking a position of mitigating sectarian tensions in Iraq. And the Najaf ulama maintains the state of Iraq belongs to all Iraqis, and indicates that the government should not pursue policies that consider only one sect. So implicitly they are helping to eliminate the notion of marginalization in the Shia ideology. So the Najaf's disposition is an important topic from my point of view. I would like to also hear your position. I mean, because 2014, for instance, was a very critical turning point in terms of Najaf's position and in terms of interaction between Najaf and the other political Islamists. You know, Sistani's fatwa in 2014 regarding the ISIS and publicly declaring that Iraq was in need of a new leader, implying that Maliki should leave. These were two main important, I think, critical historical moments. I mean, as you know, Sistani issued a fatwa calling on Iraqi citizens, all Iraqi citizens, to defend the country, and he was not mentioning just the Shia groups, just saying the whole, it was not a religious sentiment, he was not calling or addressing to religious sentiment, but rather to a nationalist sentiments and feelings to all Iraqis. And again, in the same year, responding to a letter written by members in Maliki's Dawa party, asking for Sistani's instructions, Sistani told them that Iraq needed a new leader who was acceptable to all parties. So, given the fact that the political Islamist Shia groups, their national and regional policies were harming not only the Iraqi interest but also the Shia interest, the Najaf ulama or Shia groups in Najaf felt obliged to raise their voices and become more vocal about daily politics in a more inclusive and constructive fashion. This is my reading. I don't know if you agree or not. But, so, I have two questions. One is about the Iranian influence and Iranian role, and the second one is about the Sistani's position. So, traditionally there are some differences between Iranian and Iraqi Shias. These differences should properly be taken into account, I think, and we know that their understandings and priorities are very different. Do you think to what extent this distinction will be able to be kept within the context of this new and activist Shia political awareness that you are mentioning? And could you please talk about a little bit more about Iran's sway of Iraq? I mean, can we say that Iran's sway over Iraq is growing with Iranian-supported groups? For instance, Kataib al-Hizbullah previously announced that it accepts the doctrine of Vilayat al-Faqih and sees Khamenei as their imam. Moreover, Asad al-Haq, for instance, accepted Kazim al-Airi, who lives in Iran and has adopted the principles of Iranian revolution as their religious leader. So, to what extent this differentiation in Shia groups will affect the newly emerging Iraqi Shiism understanding in the post-Sistani period? I'm asking this because there are no written rules regulating the selection of the Grand Marji, and there is no consensually identified steps to identify who is going to be the next one, and there are different conflicting interests within the Shia groups as well. So, I mean, it's really a difficult question to identify who's going to be the next Grand Marji. So, I would like to hear about these things. I mean, the role of Sistani or the Grand Marji in Najaf and the role of Iran within this general picture in Shias. Thank you so much.
Should I answer or wait for other questions and then go at them? It's up to you.
We can open the floor for this Q&A as well, of course. Okay. Or you may just want to answer first. Okay?
Okay, so thank you very much. So first, I wanted you to elaborate more on the word that was very central in your talk, which is marginalization, because at some moments you were talking about self-exclusion, which is not exactly synonym of marginalization, because marginalization implies an act from the other against you. Is it victimhood you're talking about, or self-exclusion, or marginalization? Then you put so much emphasis on the influence of the puritanical worldview, and very little emphasis on how this worldview actualized, how it operates on the social level, how is it appealing to the population. I mean, we know that, like in every religion, there is some degree of tendency towards Puritanism, but how is that on daily basis? On how is it lived by the social constituencies of theologians. And here, what I want to mention is probably building on a Weberian approach toward religion, is that it's true that there's the puritanical vision, but there's also the pragmatic and mundane consequences of that. And I would here emphasize, for example, the attitude towards the state. We know that, as you said, in Shia theology and jurisprudence, the state is illegitimate as long as it is not ruled by the imam, the infallible imam. And the Shia theologians decided that they are the deputies of imam. But this philosophy had its implications in terms of how authority is exercised, is conducted in the temporal world. That is, for example, an important issue here is the khums, is the religious tax that Shia theologians ask their followers to pay to them, because they are the ones who represent the imam. It's not the state. The state is illegitimate. The state is a usurper of power. How that pragmatic dimension of Shia theology has influenced the scope of authority they exercise in society. Besides, I mean, what I feel is that, like you're talking about, although I agree with the general line of the argument, but you're talking as if all Shias are actually following what the theologians were saying. But we know that even in the moments of the foundation of the Iraqi state, the Shia identity wasn't yet crystallized. There were interjecting identities, hybridity. The rural identity was much more important among some segments of population than their sectarian identity. We know that the many tribes that converted to Shiasm converted only in the 19th century, which is very, very short period for the identity to become rooted in the mentality of people. You put so much emphasis on how people think, regardless of the daily reality. And I will mention here, for example, the 1935-36 uprising by the Shia tribes, in which Shia tribes allied with a political wing in Baghdad, with part of the Sunni political elite, and then they went to the Shia marja, to the Shia mujtahid, to ask him for support. So it's not their tendency to follow with the Shia marja, but their need to use his, let's say, moral authority to support their own political and economic interest in that dispute. Finally, in your last assessment of Muqtada Sadr and of all the dynamics that happened recently, you focus so much on the logic of the sect and how different opinions and
I'm sorry, say
the logic of the sect in the sense how the views of leading politicians or figures in Shiasm differed after Maliki's experience. But you are still talking about an internal debate within the sect. But I invite you also to focus on the logic of the state. The state has its own logic. The state, when you are a prime minister, when you have the political authority, the army, the bureaucracy, that creates some influence on the way you behave, regardless of your sectarian or religious belonging. If you are Saddam Hussein or Nur al-Maliki or Haider Abadi, there's a logic in the state that influenced thinking, and perhaps for some extent it shaped Maliki's behavior and actions, which is, in a way, if you compare it, for example, to Masoud Barzani, a Kurdish leader and the president of Kurdish region, it's not that different, really. It's the same tendency to be authoritarian, it's the same tendency to use patronage, to use rentierism to gain more power. So these are, I have many other comments, but we could continue after the seminar.
Thanks. Any other questions? I'm just documenting things that I would know. So I take it.
One more question.
Sure. Okay.
I'll go ahead with my question. It's a very brief one. Thank you for a very lucid presentation. I very much appreciate the dialogue that came out at certain moments between the material conditions and the ideology or the perception. And what I understood was we moved from a history of purity, which was somewhat based on a discursive genealogy of purity, a dominant theological position, to a condition of impurity, that's the modernization and the citizenship that you mentioned, and now we're into a phase of a plurality of voices and worldviews. And my question is basically, if we put aside the discursive genealogical element of the past, wouldn't we also find a plurality of voices and worldviews as well? Thank you.
So it would not. Okay, thank you very much for these useful, I would say some provocative questions. Okay, let's go the Iranian or the Sistani factor. Let's begin with the Sistani factor. My reading about this is that over the past 7-8 years that there has been a shift in the Sistani role position, actually moving from what I still consider a Shia position, a traditional Shia position couched in a nationalist language. These are the early years, into a different, really more egalitarian, more truly, or I wouldn't close to nationalism, meaning taking into consideration that others exist not as basically followers, taking them seriously, investing more in the whole idea of citizenship. The early position of Sistani, and this was crystallized really in his early guidelines or fatwas, however you want to call them, calling for early elections, supporting the early Shia alliance, and he was clear about it. He didn't mince words. He talked about Iraqis. He avoided the Marja'iyya basically more or less, and that's part of its own function, its own conception of self. Okay, there is the sectarian language in the theology books. If you look at Sistani's theology book, it's a title that lots of theologians use. There's a clear distinction. The mu'min, the believer, is a Shia. Mukhalif, the dissenter, is a Sunni, and there's a hierarchy. The mu'min is better than the mukhalif. And this has been a Shia position for the last 1400 years. It's a hierarchy in terms of humanity. It's a hierarchy in terms of value. You know, a dissenter is more or less inferior. You're not accorded all rights. Or that is still a Sistani position in his theology book. That is even a position Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, Muqtada's father. That is part of the structure of purism. Okay? So that requires a certain kind of language coded carefully. You have to know a lot about the theological language. You know, they don't say Sunnis, they say Mukhalif. Okay, the dissenter. What is the dissenter? You have to dig deep into these really long, complex anthology books, or books on theology that hardly nobody reads unless you go through the religious school of the Marja'iyya in Najaf or on Qom. Ordinary Shias do not read these. Even if they decide to read them, they would not understand them. The language is complex, really old, convoluted more or less. So he belongs personally, psychologically, ideologically to that purest worldview. Theology hasn't been revised. It is the theology which emerges from doctrine that makes these positions available. Okay, that is one discourse, and there is the public discourse, talking to Iraqis, talking about politics, the tainted, impure field. Okay, and in that discourse, he uses a more form of egalitarian language. At the surface level, I would say in the early years, even that egalitarian approach was more or less superficial rather than deep. Why? In 2004, and it still exists actually on his web page, when he said, basically urged Shias to vote for the United Shia Alliance, and his rationale was, he spoke respectively about others, all Iraqis, but these people are religious people. They're known for, integrity, and the language was used with religious integrity, more or less. It's your religious, you're being a mu'min, a good mu'min, in the Shia sense of the word, a good believer, okay? After he just said all of the nice things, they're all equal, but we know those people, they're good people, they're people of integrity. Who are those? The Shia political parties, okay? And he favored them. That is harking back to this purest worldview, couched in political language. Most people would not link that pronouncement to this theoretical root. Okay? Now, and that's another example of how experience, how pragmatism revised ideology. Not fully in the context of Sistani. We will see the next generation of scholars, Shia scholars, religious scholars, theologians, if they would make that change. By 2009, 2008, 2009, 2010, Sistani, through his representatives, breaks away from this, overt support for the political elite. We're talking about the Shia political elite, of course, the ruling elite, and there is criticism based on issues. Corruption, handling security, state appointments, nepotism, so on and so forth. And that develops later, by 2012, certainly 2014, into a frontal attack at the Shia political class. No longer his electoral positions are biased. Asked more or less for the removal of Maliki, a more proactive approach, okay, in order to rectify the situation. The Marja'iyya basically felt that its legacy was threatened, that Iraq in 2014 was very significant in this. Iraq was going to break up at the Shia watch. It is these Shia politicians that we as a Marja'iyya sanction, that we basically put in power by telling people to go and elect them, and by our more or less refusal to take a clear position against them. It is those politicians that will cause the breakup of Iraq, and it will be counted against us. The whole idea of legacy is extremely important for the Marja'iyya. Future is also important for it. But the whole notion that this Marja'iyya, and that's also a purist idea, it has not involved in itself and the tainting acts of politics that led to the suffering of people. So after the Marja'iyya basically receded from public view, from political debates or political positions, probably since 2006 until 2010, we start to see a more proactive role, criticism, correcting, and then the tone gets increasingly critical and more comprehensive. And it culminated actually in the call for the removal of Maliki. No longer is possible, this is a political issue and we maintain the same distance from others. No, the whole idea that the tried should not be tried, mujarrab la yujarrab, was a very clear political position. Those that we called for, that we trusted in 2005, 2006, and asked people to vote for, they have been tried and they have failed. Make a different choice. That is the furthest that the Shia Marja'iyya in Najaf would go in saying we were wrong, without really saying it. So it is playing a constructive role, I would say, after 2010. I think before 2010, I would not make the argument that its role was constructive. It was biased, and it accepted some of the assumptions that I've discussed about the purest worldview. But the Marja'iyya itself has gotten out of this, and that probably goes back to your question about the state. The Marja'iyya is probably now having a better understanding of the state functions and how you could use it as a tool to redress injustices, to create a sense of stability, to resolve conflict. So it's not only that Maliki has learned from the state, but the Marja'iyya itself has learned from the state. It got involved, its representatives, in lots of state-related details. And there is newly found awareness that translates in more delicate, finely tuned positions. However, my argument is that lots of these positions, purism is really large and it's being redefined while maintaining the boundaries. So it is being enlarged, it is being more flexible, but its primary assumption of a Shia superiority, a Shia authentic claim to truth remains the same. What it is basically saying is that these Shias are not good. The authentic Shias, the Shias who really follow the faith, who really follow what Imam Ali did, who really followed, these would deliver you.
You find the same with Arab nationals. They will say, traitors and
No, that's true. It's just the whole idea. It's not that the intellectual, philosophical, or doctrinal apparatus is wrong. It's those who have invested in it, invested in the wrong way. Maliki is an example. Now let's go to the Iranian. So Sistani is a positive factor, playing a constructive role now, has been over the past 7-8 years, has an important reigning presence, reigning Shia excesses, and basically an assuring presence for Sunnis. Don't go too far, and most of his positions are pro-state positions. Example is the fatwa about the popular mobilization units. He never sanctioned the notion of Hajj al-Shabi, always said function within the state, let the state lead, although he remained silent on this large organization called Hajj al-Shabi, which is something about purism, the refusal to really take a clear stand on certain issues. They just like ignoring the elephant in the room. Lots of the Hajj al-Shabi people, and do also, they're an important constituency even for the Marja'iyya. Would the Marja'iyya take a position? I mean, this issue, this question is worth further investigation. The Iranian influence, the difficulty, certainly there is Iranian influence in Iraq. It would be surreal to ignore or deny that influence. But the way this influence functions is a lot more important than its own existence. Iran's influence in Iraq is not state-on-state influence. It's not like the American influence or Saudi influence, where you really go through a state exercising pressure on another state, or the fear of this other state, that's not how Iran functions in Iraq. The complexity of the Iranian influence is that it is the ways in which it weaves itself into the structure of the Iraqi society, into the structure of Iraqi Shiism, and into the structure of the Iraqi political movements. So basically, it is not Iranian positions that are being promoted in Iraq. What the way the Iranian influence functions is that these are Iraqi positions. No, these are Iraqi political agents taking these positions, which are essentially Iranian positions, behooving the Iranian state. You can think about popular mobilization units, and within this, the purest Shia network is being used. Okay, so in a more sense-making world, okay, in a more logical world, if you proclaim allegiance to a leader of a foreign nation, you're basically tried for treason. Particularly, I mean, if you're a state official, you cannot, as a Canadian official, you cannot claim that the President of the United States is really your intellectual, political guide, and you have to follow what that president say. You would end up in prison, even though Canada and America are really very close allies. But this is possible in Iraq. Why? In the context of Iran, it takes a religious dimension. Okay, I'm not following Khamenei as the state official, as the highest state official in Iran. I'm following Khamenei not as the person, as the religious function, the wali al-faqih, the ruling theologian, something that is sanctioned within Shiism, or at least a certain branch of Shiism. There is a theological, doctrinal argument for it. And it is the moment of the challenge between, national boundary making, national identity, and this transnational religious identity. Very fluid. And the Iranian influence so much functions on blurring the boundaries between the two. That's why Iran is effective. The further you establish Iraqi national identity, the more capable you are of stopping, deterring Iranian influence. And I think the movement of history now over the past 5-6 years has been going against the Iranian influence in that regard, the emergence of Iraqi identity. The whole idea of Iraqism. Even politicians now speak more about it, and they're, believing in it or not is another issue. But they're also, in the semi-democracy that Iraq is, there is a degree of popular censorship, let's say, of what politicians do. Okay, Sadr's position, Abadi's positions, I think they're more genuine. Their assertion of Iraqism, Iraq's national identity, is clear, and I think it became a political platform in this election, and it was partially the reason why they got votes. So the other side of this is that the Iranians in Iraq are very flexible, even as the sense of Iraqi nationalism is emerging. They adapt to it. They're very capable of doing this. Let me give you the example of the popular mobilization units. Okay, we're seeing a movement, a tangible movement in the argument. The majority of Hashd al-Sha'bi is not really under Iran's umbrella. These are people who actually wanted an institution, a way to fight ISIS, and have no Iranian interest. They do not come from a religious understanding of the ruling theologians. They're Iraqis who use a religious umbrella, Sistani, in order to fight. There was the disappointment with the state. Sistani offered them this other institutional apparatus. They got involved in it. But within Hashd al-Sha'bi, there is a minority, a very effective minority of ideological forces, fighting forces, that basically believe in the rule of the theologians. Now, when they went and fought in Syria, it was the defense of Shiism. If ISIS, if these radical Sunnis take over in Syria, we're going to be threatened, okay, so on and so forth. A position that has been routinely challenged in Iraq. Now, one mutation of this position, and this is an example of how Iranian influence functions. These groups, these forces that acted out of basically Iranian orders, more or less, now defend the same position. They're doing the same thing. They're fighting in Syria, against the will of the Iraqi state, against Iraqi law, against probably the will of Sistani. They're still fighting in Syria, but now they're presenting their fight as a defense of Iraq, Iraq's national security, not Shiism, not Shias at large. So the argument changes while trying to maintain the same status quo. Now, how sustainable is this? We will see. Iranian influence is still clear. You have Sulaimani immediately after announcing the results sitting there in public. They even don't deny it, but trying to put a government together. And that's not because the Iranians for Sulaimani, it's because of their Iraqi partners inviting and invoking. So an Iraqi Shia group would use the Iranian influence against another group, and that's the other side of it. The other side of it, with the absence of clear legal standards for this kind of behavior, any Shia political movement could basically invite Iran, side with it in its own conflict with another Shia group, and this has happened. It has been going on since 2004. So it's not really Iran imposing itself, although the Iranians, if they need and if it's possible, they would. But it is Iraqi partners inviting Iran, facilitating the process. It's very complex. We will not see a definitive moment where Iranian influence is over or one specific measure that will end it. It is a process. Now we see more naming of Iran in negative context by Iraqi politicians. Iraq has to be, in the name of nationalism, Iraq has to be, we should not follow Americans, it usually comes this way, American, Saudi, and Iranian dictates, okay? Mingling eases the position, so on and so forth. Okay, so what does marginalization or alienation, is it victimhood? Okay, this was a quick presentation, and I think your questions are very legitimate. If one dismantle how this whole thing about marginalization functions, my position is that, yes, marginalization is an act of an outside force. It doesn't come from within the group. My argument is that alienation was misrecognized by Shias as marginalization. So there's this entire narrative of perceived Sunni systematic effort to marginalize Shias. And it is widely accepted, and it's hardly ever put to a serious investigation. There are like certain moments here and there that are expanded and extended and generalized. What Saddam did in 1991. The tanks that went to Karbala or Najaf saying no Shias after today. Okay, particular moments that seem to have been so generalized, linked to a whole historical spectrum. They don't really talk about what people in the uprising were saying, which is, no other saint other than Ali. We want a Shia ruler, a position that's clearly sectarian. And that's also part of the purist worldview, is that Shiism, a Shia ruler, would ensure justice. So the whole idea of action and reaction disappears. It has to fit this overarching narrative. In general, you see lots of arguments among Shias about the identity of the rulers. I'll give you an example. I was the other day I was getting into a debate on WhatsApp about this. I'm just like the argument is so tiring. So the narrative, the purest Shia narrative, is that the Shias fought for Iraq only to get a foreign ruler who acted against them, a Sunni ruler, Faisal, 1921. So basically, in our moments of activism, doing really good things for the country, sacrificing, we're easily sold out to the Sunni rulers. I mean, the historical record is very clear. Faisal was a Shia choice. The Shias wanted Faisal. They basically organized a campaign before 1920, and this came from religious authorities, and after 1991. I mean, the record, the historical record is clear. Faisal was less a Sunni choice. It was more of a Shia choice. But you say this to a majority of Shias and they would push back against you. Why? Because people read history 1400 years ago, and they would know the nuanced details of the debate between Ali bin Abi Talib and Umar bin Khattab. Much less of this recent history. And that's also, what kind of historical investments we have is a consequence of this purist worldview. You hardly ever see a Shia political party having a view about what happened in Iraq between 1920 and say 1979. You will see lots of views about what happened in history, but not really views about what did happen in this experience of the Iraqi state. Was this good? Was this bad? Was this, in what sense it was marginalizing or empowering an entire population, a big percentage of Shias, moving into social mobility, moving into social and political agency, migrating from urban area, from rural areas into urban areas, and accessing the benefits of the state and developing a sense of identity that's different. Is that discussed? No, it's just completely absent. You go back to these overarching positions, certain selected historical moments that get generalized. The story of Imam Hussein, the Umayyad oppression of the Shia imams. These become the standard positions. These become the historical metaphors for what happened to Shiism. It is fascinating to see how ISIS and Qaeda are dealt with. These are Umayyad extensions. Whereas if you look at ISIS and Qaeda, actually they have a very negative view of the Umayyads. But in the Shia mainstream, no. These are the grandsons of these horrible ancestors, predecessors and ancestors. And it's a narrative very emotional, very appealing, and it's very difficult to break it. Even if you kind of break it with historical information, the psychological structure that sustains it is still there. So people would easily revert to this old position. Why? Because this has been the psychological training for centuries. You can't read a book and change your entire psychological orientation about something unless you are a scholar. And even scholars, lots of scholars actually would fail at doing this. Identity is very strong. It's just not easy to basically dismantle it because I read this really exciting book. Life would have been much better and much meaningful if actually books affect reality the way that we perceive. So basically, I think the historical record doesn't show this consistent marginalization. The marginalization of Shias because they're Shias, but Shia alienation that came from the purest worldview was presented to Shias as marginalization, and there were these few moments in history that were generalized and accepted as the standard historical behavior across time and place. Was there an experience of hybridity because of what happened after 2020? Yes, exactly. Iraqi communism is primarily Shia. So Okay, that has nothing to do with the purest worldview. Iraqi Baathism has very strong Shia connections. Iraqi liberalism, arts, painting, literature, most of which actually diverge or break away from the purest worldview. These are Shia's products, but they did not occur as Shia products. They occurred as Iraqi products. Basically, the sense of Iraqism that Shias developed. So the singers and the communists, the Shia communists, the Shia singers, the Shia painters do not define themselves as Shias. They define themselves as Iraqis, as modern Iraqis, acknowledging that Shiism is an important factor in their own product, but it is not overarching identity. This is one thing. The second thing is that this very important and significant experience has not been theorized. It's not in the Shia consciousness. It's not just in the Shia consciousness there is this history. It does exist among secular Shias. It does exist, but I think its presence among mainstream Shias as an idea, as a clear, well-codified idea, is very weak. People refer to it in an experiential way, but we really need a theoretical acknowledgement of this in order to make the difference. People's ways of acting in public sanctioned ways becomes possible when you codify it and talk about it, and you give it legitimacy. Out of other is not there plurality of voices within the purest? I think there has always been a plurality. I mean, this oneness is an ideological construct. Always there's plurality. Always there's a conflict, but it's the boundaries within which this plurality occurs. Even within Shiism, there's plurality. Because without this plurality, Shiism, Christianity, Judaism would die. Just basically die. It has to respond to pressures. And within Shiism, I mean, very brief, I don't want to keep you guys further. I mean, one significant moment is that purism pontificated or talked about a direct relationship to the infallible imams. Everything has to come from the infallible imam. Has to be direct and has to be clear. So our job, the job of a clergyman, is only to recognize if the imam actually said this and to interpret what he said. Okay? And then historically there was the emergence of the rationalist tradition in Shiism. It's like, well, this is not possible because there are new emerging issues. The imams didn't deal with them because that was not part of their time. Okay? Now, the emergence of the theologian as active, rational agent of interpretation, what's called aql. The theologian can basically develop a position that the imams did not deal with. Okay? So that's what became ijtihad, exerting the effort, with the intellectual effort in order to arrive at a position. The overall function of ijtihad is to maintain purism, but not purism in the narrow, direct, literal sense of the early centuries. So there is a plurality. There is also plurality about ruling a state. In the beginning it was big no, but now they find the modality. The modality is that, well, you're the representative of the imam. So you rule in the name of the imam. A way of extending legitimacy, religious legitimacy. There is a plurality, but plurality of voices, as long as things happen in a context. If you violate the outer boundaries of the context, you're outside. There is no influence. So if you as a Shia theologian decide, there's these cardinal moments. I mean, Michel Foucault talks about this a lot. Discourse. How does a discourse function? If you say the imams are infallible, and you come up the imams are fallible. The imams are not infallible. That is, you're immediately outside Shiism. So your plurality would not have a Shia effect. You become part of Sunnism. So that there's just like a sort of mechanism, modality, context for this plurality to function. You have to fit your new position into this larger edifice of purism by reinterpreting it, making it more flexible, but not violating its cardinal understanding, which is a purism. I think I've answered all the questions. I'm not sure that you want to continue this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.